Meta's Llama 3 drops, and it's much better than expected.
We're open sourcing the first set of our Llama 3 models at 8 billion and 70 billion parameters. They have best-in-class performance for their scale. And we've also got a lot more releases coming soon that are going to bring multimodality and bigger context windows. We're also still training a larger, dense model with more than 400 billion parameters.
That's not even a question for me, whether we're going to go take a swing at building the next thing. I'm just incapable of not doing that.
So here Mark is talking about what's coming down the pipeline. Take a listen. Notice what's being released right now, but also more importantly, what's coming just around the corner.
Yeah. But I think, if you want to get under the hood a bit, the Llama 3 stuff is obviously the most technically interesting. So, we're basically, for the first version, we're training 3 versions, an 8 billion and a 70 billion, which we're releasing today, and a 405 billion dense model, which is still training. So we're not releasing that today. But, the 8 and 70, I'm pretty excited about how they turned out. It's, they're leading for their scale. We'll release a blog post with all the benchmarks so people can check it out themselves. And obviously it's open source, so people get a chance to play with it. We have a roadmap of new releases coming that are going to bring multimodality, more multilinguality, bigger context windows to those as well. And then, hopefully sometime later in the year, we'll get to roll out the 405, which I think is in training, it's still training, but for where it is right now in training, it is already at around 85 mmLU, and just we expect that it's going to have leading benchmarks on a bunch of the benchmarks. So I'm pretty excited about all of that. The 70 billion is great too. We're releasing that today. It's around 82 mmLU and has leading scores on math and reasoning. So it's I think just getting this in people's hands is going to be pretty wild.
Pretty wild is, I think, a good way of putting it, because, so here's the 8 billion parameter, here's the 70 billion parameter. As you can see here, the 8 billion Llama 3 is beating the others in its class by quite a bit. And the 70 billion is also doing incredibly well when compared to the likes of Gemini Pro 1.5 and Claude 3 Sonnet. And we'll take a look at what they're doing here to get these good results. But what he's talking about is the next big thing that's being trained right now that's going to come out and be available soon. So here's Dr. Jim Fan. He's saying the upcoming Llama 3 400 billion plus parameters. So Mark Zuckerberg was referring it to as the 405 billion parameters. But that model will mark the watershed moment that the community gains open weight access to a GPT-4 class model. It will change the calculus for many research efforts and grassroots startups. I pulled the numbers of Claude 3 Opus, GPT-4, the latest one, April 9th, 2024, and Gemini Pro and Ultra, Gemini Pro 1.5 and Gemini Ultra 1.0. These are the titans. These are the state-of-the-art, the best-in-class models, or not even best-in-class, just the best models available to the world as far as we know. And of course, they're made by OpenAI, Anthropic, and Google. Each one is a large organization with its own philosophy, with its own culture. And these best-in-class models are proprietary. They're closed source. If the company decides you shouldn't be able to use it for certain purposes, you won't be able to. And now we're approaching a time when Llama 3B 405 billion parameter model is going to be coming out. And here's how it compares across the MMLU. It's right there, right next to GPT-4 Turbo, the smarter, better model with the newer updates, Claude 3 Opus, which a lot of people were kind of stunned how incredible it was, how big of a leap it was. It became the #1 model, beating out GPT-4 for a number of weeks or maybe even months. And of course, this new Llama 3 model, again, this is the unreleased one, the one that's being trained right now, it sounds like, it will be better than Gemini Pro 1.5. In fact, it looks like it's beating out Gemini on human eval, on math, and is toe-to-toe with Claude 3 Opus and GPT-4 Turbo. And Dr. Jim Fan continues, Llama 3 400 billion parameters still training and will hopefully get even better in the next few months. There's so much research potential that can be unlocked with such a powerful backbone. Expecting a surge in builder energy across the ecosystem. He's not kidding. We've covered quite a few projects backed by GPT-4 that are absolutely stunning, some including by Dr. Jim Fan for autonomous AI agents, for training robotics in simulation, already as is a GPT-4 model is extremely capable. And now when this thing comes out, it will match the capabilities of those models, but it will be open source, run locally. Now of course, this is going to be this is going to be used for research. This is going to be used for startups. I mean, you're probably not going to be running it on your home machine. This is unlikely to be run by individuals quite yet, but I got to say, the 70 billion parameter model isn't that far behind. Now here, Mark is going to talk about why he's open sourcing these models. If you recall that Google leaked email, "We have no moat," they were saying that in a situation like this where everyone can have their own model, there isn't a moat that's kind of protecting that sort of AI model system. Everyone can build their own. Actually going open source and then getting the world to be, sort of your development center for everyone across the world to work on your model is actually a good strategy. It's potentially the winning strategy. Take a listen to what he says.
And this is one of the reasons why I'm kind of philosophically so pro open source, is I do think that a concentration of AI in the future has the potential to be as dangerous as kind of it being widespread. So I think a lot of people are, they think about the questions of, okay, well, if it can do this stuff, is it bad for it to be out wild, like just kind of widely available? I think another version of this is like, okay, well, it's probably also pretty bad for one institution to have an AI that is way more powerful than everyone else's AI, right? So if you look at like I guess one security analogy that I think of is, it doesn't take AI to basically, okay, there's security holes in so many different things. And if you could travel back in time a year or 2 years, right? It's like, that's not AI. It's like let's say you just have like 1 year or 2 years more knowledge of the security holes. You can pretty much hack into like any system, right? So it's not that far-fetched to believe that a very intelligent AI would probably be able to identify some holes and basically be like a human who could potentially go back in time a year or two and compromise all these systems. Okay, so how have we dealt with that as a society? Well, one big part is open source software that makes it so that when improvements are made to the software, it doesn't just kind of get stuck in one company's products, but it can kind of be broadly deployed to a lot of different systems, whether it's banks or hospitals or government stuff. And like just everyone can kind of, like, as the software gets hardened, which happens because more people can see it and more people can bang on it, and there are standards on how this stuff works, the world can kind of get upgraded together pretty quickly. And I kind of think that a world where AI is very widely deployed in a way where it's gotten hardened progressively over time, and is one where all the different systems will be in check in a way that seems like it is fundamentally more healthy to me than one where this is more concentrated. So there are risks on all sides, but I think that that's one risk that I think I don't hear them talking about quite as much. I think like there's sort of the risk of like, okay, well, what if the AI system does something bad? I am more like, I stay up at night more worrying, well, what if like some actor that, whatever, it's like from wherever you sit, there's going to be some actor who you don't trust. If they're the ones who have like the super strong AI, whether it's some like other government that is sort of like an opponent of our country, or some company that you don't trust, or whatever it is, like I think that that's potentially a much bigger risk.
As in,
For sure,
they could like overthrow our government because they have a weapon that like nobody else has.
in the worst case scenario, enslave the human race forever, right? If you have an advanced system like that and you can prevent everybody else from catching up, and we assume the same kind of exponential growth, one actor controlling AGI that's exponentially getting better, potentially improving itself, think about where that would go, how that would unfold. The Roman army was very advanced for its time, but what would happen if it would fight a more modern, more advanced, more technologically advanced enemy? There's actually something called the Ultimate Epic Battle Simulator 2, where you can have things like this play out. Here's one Sherman tank against 2 million Roman soldiers. Here are the 2 million Roman soldiers storming the one Sherman tank. Who would you bet on? Who do you think will win this battle? Again, so here's that tank, just one. For purposes of what we're talking about, think of this as AGI or ASI. This is the one nation state or one bad actor that was allowed to develop ASI without anyone else having the chance to participate in that development. And you and I, the rest of us, are these little Roman soldiers. No matter how tough we are, how brave we are, or how just our cause is, this is what could potentially happen to us in that scenario.
As in, they could like overthrow our government because they have a weapon
Or
that
just
like nobody else has.
cause a lot of mayhem, right? I think it's like I mean I think the intuition is that this stuff ends up being pretty kind of important and valuable for both kind of economic and kind of security and other things. And I don't know. I just think, yeah, if someone who you don't trust or is an adversary of you gets something that is more powerful, then I think that could be an issue. And I think probably the best way to mitigate that is to have good open source AI that basically becomes the standard, and in a lot of ways kind of can become the leader. And in that way, it just ensures that it's a much more kind of even and balanced playing field. Combated a lot of this type of harmful content is by building AI systems that are smarter than the adversarial ones. And I guess this kind of informs part of my theory on this, right? Is if you look at like the different types of harm that people do or try to do through social networks, there are ones that are not very adversarial. So for example, like hate speech, I would say is not super adversarial in the sense that like people aren't getting better at being racist, right? They're just like, you just like, okay, if you kind of, that's one where I think the AIs are generally just getting way more sophisticated faster than people are at those issues. So we have issues both ways. It's like people do bad things, that whether they're trying to incite violence or something, but we also have a lot of false positives, right? So where we basically censor stuff that we shouldn't, and I think understandably make a lot of people annoyed. So I think having an AI that just gets increasingly precise on that's going to be good over time. But let me give you another example, which is like nation states trying to interfere in elections. That's an example where they have cutting edge technology and absolutely get better each year. So we block some technique, they learn what we did, they come at us with a different technique, right? It's not like a person trying to, I don't know, say mean things, right? It's like they're basically, they have a goal, they're sophisticated, they have a lot of technology. In those cases, I still think the ability to kind of have our AI systems grow in sophistication at a faster rate than theirs have. It's an arms race, but I think we're at least currently winning that arms race. So I don't know. I think but this is like a lot of the stuff that I spend time thinking about is like, okay, yes, it is possible that whether it's Llama 4 or Llama 5 or Llama 6, yeah, we need to think about like what behaviors we're observing. And it's not just us. I think part of the reason why you make this open source is that there are a lot of other people who study this too. So yeah, we want to see what other people are observing, what we're observing, what we can mitigate, and then we'll make our assessment on whether we can make it open source. But I think for the foreseeable future, I'm optimistic we will be able to.
Next, we're talking a little bit about synthetic data. So using data generated by computers, by AI, to train sort of the next generation of AI models. The amount of data that we have in the world was considered a big stumbling block, sort of a obstacle for us to keep improving and expanding these models. However, a lot of the latest research seems to suggest that synthetic data can be very effective for training models. And as you'll notice with this new release of Llama 3, the amount of data that was used to train it is rather large. So
actually, I found the synthetic data thing really curious. I'm actually interested in why you don't think like current models, it makes sense why there might be an asymptote with just doing the synthetic data again and again.
Yeah.
But if they get smarter and you use the kind of techniques you talk about in the paper or the blog post that's coming out on the day this will be released, where it goes to the thought chain that is the most correct, why this wouldn't like lead to a loop that of course it wouldn't be overnight, but over many months or years of training potentially with a smarter model, it gets smarter, makes better output, gets smarter, and so forth.
Well, I think it could within the parameter of whatever the model architecture is. It's just that like at some level, I don't know. I think like today's 8 billion parameter models, I just don't think you're going to be able to get to be as good as the state-of-the-art multi-hundred billion parameter models that are incorporating new research into the architecture itself.
But those will be open source as well, right?
Well, yeah, but I think that's if I mean subject to all of the questions that we just talked about.
Sure.
But yes, I mean we would hope that that'll be the case. But I think that at each point, I don't know. It's like when you're building software, there's like a ton of stuff that you can do with software, but then at some level you're constrained by the chips that it's running on, right? So there are always going to be different physical constraints. And it's like how big are the models is going to be constrained by how much energy you can get and use for inference. So I guess I'm simultaneously very optimistic that this stuff will continue to improve quickly, and also a little more measured than I think some people are about kind of its. I just don't think the runaway case is like a particularly likely one.
So we'll come back to the interview in just a second, but I wanted to take a look at this actual blog post, this announcement that kind of covers the most important things about Llama 3. So, of course, they're releasing the 8 billion and the 70 billion parameter pre-trained and instruction-tuned versions to support a wide range of applications. The 400 plus the 405 billion, still training, still not available. It sounds like the intention is to make that open source as well when it does come out. But of course, that's subject to various safety checks, etc., that Mark was talking about. Obviously, if it poses some great threats, then it will not be open source. So we've seen the benchmarks, which are indeed incredibly impressive. And they're saying here that the Llama 3 models take data and scale it to new heights. It's been trained on our 2 recently announced custom-built 24K GPU clusters and over 15 trillion token of data, including 4x more code. This results in the most capable Llama model yet, which supports 8K context length that doubles the capacity of Llama 2, including 4x more code. Now, the one interesting thing that Mark Zuckerberg mentioned in an interview is that initially they didn't think they would need to train any of this on code. I mean, they were looking to kind of use something like a chatbot for WhatsApp, for Facebook, etc. But they changed their mind when they realized that training on code made the models just smarter at everything. So even if you just wanted something that could talk back and forth with you and not necessarily write code or output code, training on code improved its abilities. It was able to generalize over a wider skill set if it was trained on code. Now, a lot of people are wondering, that massive data set, the 7 times larger than what was used for the previous models, is that synthetic data? Here's where they get into that a little bit. Now, if you're not aware, there's a lot of research, but it's kind of almost like this dirty secret that not too many people talk about. I first heard this idea from one of Microsoft research papers that they were talking about, that if you wanted to train your own model, what you could do is actually take the outputs of another smart model and use that data to train your model. And this works for text-based large language models. This works, you might have seen recently that Adobe Firefly, recently came out that Adobe Firefly was trained on Mid-Journey images. So it was using Mid-Journey, the AI generation platform, to train its own, image generation platform. And this is happening way more often than you might imagine. There was a leak out of Google saying they were training on GPT-4. And so the point here is you can kind of almost not exactly copy and paste a model. It's not as simple as all that. But if you have access to a large model and you're able to extract that synthetic data, that output, then you're able to use that data to train your own model that oftentimes it could potentially be as good as the original. Maybe at some point we might even find a way to make it better. Some of this is theoretical, but it's a real possibility.
Like a lot of data centers are on the order of 50 megawatts or 100 megawatts, or like a big one might be 150 megawatts. Okay, so you take a whole data center and you fill it up with just all the stuff that you need to do for training, and you build the biggest cluster you can. I think I think a bunch of companies are running at stuff like that. But I mean, just to, I guess, put this in perspective, I think a gigawatt, it's like around the size of like a meaningful nuclear power plant only going towards training a model.
But it doesn't have to be in the same place, right? If distributed training works, it can be...
That I think is a big question.
Yeah.
Right, is basically how that's going to work. And I do think in the future, it seems quite possible that more of what we call training for these big models is actually more along the lines of inference generating synthetic data to then go feed into the model. So I don't know what that ratio is going to be, but I consider the generation of synthetic data to be more inference than training today. But obviously, if you're doing it in order to train a model, it's part of the broader training process. So I don't know. That's an open question, is to kind of what the balance of that and how that plays out.
If that's the case, would that potentially also be the case with Llama 3? And maybe like Llama 4 onwards, where you put this out and if somebody has a ton of compute, then using the models that you've put out, you can just keep making these things arbitrarily smarter. like some Kuwait or UAE or some random country has a ton of compute, and they can just actually just use Llama 4 to just make something much smarter.
I do think that there are going to be dynamics like that, but I also think that there is a fundamental limitation on kind of the network architecture, right, or the kind of model architecture, right? So I think like a 70 billion model that kind of we trained with the Llama 3 architecture can get better, right? It can keep going. Like I was saying, it's, you know, we felt like if we kept on feeding it more data or rotated the high value tokens through again, then you know, it would continue getting better. But and we've seen a bunch of other people around the world, you know, different companies basically take the Llama 2 70 billion base, like take that model architecture and then build a new model. It's still the case that when you make a generational improvement to the kind of Llama 3 70 billion or the Llama 3 405, there's nothing open source, anything like that today, right? Like it's not, I think that's like, it's a big step function and what people are going to be able to build on top of that. I don't think can go infinitely from there. I think there can be some optimization in that until you get to the next step function.
Yeah. Okay. So let's zoom out a little bit from specific.
So for people that may be not familiar with this, so basically if you think of the version 1 of an AI system, let's say it outputs code or images, whatever you want, videos, right? So this is a human, a person. We created the data to train that model, right? We took pictures of the world, we wrote books, et cetera, and we put that into the model. And that model was able to replicate some of the stuff that we do, text, et cetera. Now it's becoming apparent, and has been for some time now, that you can take the outputs, the inference from these models, put it into sort of the next generation of models, V2. So we can use this AI to almost help create a better, more advanced AI by taking the stuff this produces and pumping it into here, into version 2.0. So the question was, if you have a Llama 3 open source, could somebody with massive amounts of resources, massive amounts of compute, could they take that, you know, create 2.0 and then create, you know, infinity, create something that's just better and better and better and better? Like, is this just creates this intelligence explosion or not? So Mark is saying that no, there's some limit here, right? There's some sort of a limit to how far you can take this from this sort of base model, right? So if you have Llama 3, could you create Llama 42 or whatever, right? And he's saying, no, you can probably create Llama 4, Llama 5, however you want to think of that, but there's some sort of a limiting function, some sort of a limiting step there. And Stanford recently put out a state of the AI report that kind of showed that at least some of the research in there seemed to suggest that over multiple generations, you do have this kind of compounding corruption thing going on. They did it with image models where by like the 6th generation, like the faces that they were trying to produce were warped. There were these kind of artifacts on them. There were these stripes and weird colors where they didn't look like real images. So generation 1, 2, they were fine. You'd look at it and you're like, okay, that looks like a human being. By 6 and 7, it's like, whoa, that's getting weirder and weirder. So we've yet to see how that happens, but one interesting thing to kind of keep an eye on. But Mark's point here, I think, is that it won't be this runaway thing that we have to worry about. There's some limitations that will prevent this infinite scaling of these models by, you know, potentially a bad person, right? A bad actor.
You know, in like the cosmic scale, obviously it'll happen quickly over a couple of decades or something. But I do think that there is some set of people who are afraid of, like, you know, it really just kind of spins and goes from being like somewhat intelligent to extremely intelligent overnight. And I just think that there's all these physical constraints that make that so that's unlikely to happen. I just don't really see that playing out. So I think we'll have time to kind of acclimate a bit, but it will really change the way that we work and give people all these creative tools to do different things that I think it's going to be, it's going to really enable people to do the things that they want a lot more is my view.
And in terms of there being a physical limitation of some sort, certainly we've been seeing that, right? When GPT-4 first came out, a lot of people were saying, you know, AGI is right around the corner. And certainly we've seen massive progress, a lot of forward progress, but there's a huge bottleneck for, you know, creating these models. And that's basically GPU chips, really. NVIDIA, one of the reasons that it became, you know, incredibly valuable, the stock price just skyrocketed. It was this massive crunch in these chips that were able to train these models and run inference. And now there's a lot more companies that are developing their own chips with their own sort of applications. Everybody's everybody's trying something new. Sam Altman, of course, infamously said that the world will need to invest something along the lines of 7 trillion to build up the global infrastructure. Now, that was taken to mean that he wants somebody to give him 7 trillion to build it out. That's not what he meant. He later went on the Lex Fridman podcast and kind of explained that. He's like, if you look across the board, across the entire world, and all the pieces of infrastructure that need to be installed to support this sort of growth of AI, that CapEx, that sort of expenditure, that'll be somewhere along the lines of like 7 trillion invested over decades and decades for us to get there. With that said, the context length window is 8,000, which out of everything we've heard here, that's the only thing that kind of falls flat a little bit, right? Because just every other number here is like incredible and just hitting it out of the ballpark. But with the context length, we're used to 128,000. That's what used to be kind of like the biggest model. That's where a lot of the best models are right now. But you also have the 1 million context window for some models like Gemini. Also, and apparently it's able to run at that large context window without losing its ability to find the data in that large amount of text. So that needle in a haystack, as they're calling it. Now, with that said, this is one of the terms of use, or one of the terms you're agreeing to when using Llama 3. This last part is kind of important. They're saying if you use the Llama materials to create, train, fine-tune, or otherwise improve an AI model, which is distributed or made available, you shall also include Llama 3 at the beginning of any such AI model name. So in that scenario where another company uses Llama 3 to train their very own model, according to these terms, they have to name that model Llama 3 something. Imam Mustak jumps in with a brand new model that apparently he's going to be training on Llama 3, the Llama 3 Waifu Husbando Uwu edition. I'm happy to be an early tester. Send it right over. So this is Aston Zhang, research scientist at the Llama team of Meta Generative AI, designing and training large language models. Opinions are my own, not unless, of course, somebody managed to hypnotize him, in which case his opinions would not be his own. And he's saying Llama 3 has been my focus since joining the Llama team last summer, and he's posting some interesting things. Our largest models exceed 400 billion parameters and are still training. So this is the same thing that Mark Zuckerberg said, and he's saying scaling is the recipe. Demanding more than better scaling laws and infrastructure, for example, managing high effective training time across 16K GPUs, requires innovative strategies. This, I believe, was the rumor that Microsoft, some of their engineers were complaining that if they put too many GPUs too close together, it'll crash the state's power grid. So they're talking a bit about high quality data curation, enhanced human data, and while automated benchmarks are useful, they don't fully reflect a model's grasp of nuanced context. Our human evaluations are carefully designed and performed. It looks like they are making Llama 3 multimodal, so that's in the pipeline as well. And it sounds like they're not using a mixture of experts, which has kind of been the popular go-to GPT-4, the new Gemini 1.5 Pro, the Mixtral. They're using a mixture of experts, which seem to be a great approach for doing this and creating models that are more like efficient and still are just as effective as the larger models by splitting them into smaller experts that each handle their own thing. So super exciting. And assuming all of this comes to pass in terms of the 405 billion model coming out, becoming open source, I think that's going to put to rest a lot of the fears that open source will not be able to catch up or be as sort of dynamic and powerful as the closed sourced proprietary models. I gotta say, I'm pretty surprised that this is driven by Meta. If you went back a few years and you said, who's going to be the biggest proponent of putting out open sourced artificial intelligence into the market, when the bigger players chose to remain closed source, they asked you, who would you guess that is? I would not have guessed Facebook, and Mark Zuckerberg. But super, super excited to see what's coming next. I'll link the interview with Mark Zuckerberg in the show notes. Down below. Check it out. If you're not yet subscribed, please subscribe. It helps me put more content out there. Keep in mind that the vast majority of people out there have not experienced even GPT-4. They haven't interacted with it. They're not really following along all these super fast developments that are happening. My hope is to get this information out to a wider audience, get everyone involved. This is extremely exciting technology. It's extremely powerful technology. And I'm in agreement with Mark here that a lot of people that talk about the existential risks of AI, it becoming Terminator and destroying the humanity, we do, of course, have to be careful and make sure that we're devoting time to AI safety. But I'm very much in agreement with what he said, is a lot of the people that are talking about that don't really talk about the other dangers, the potentially much more obvious dangers. For example, an authoritarian regime capturing something like this and not allowing other people to use it, or some bad actor using it, or even if you imagine somebody who you disagree with on some level, whether that's political or philosophical, if they're able to ingrain the AI with their own mindset and prevent anyone else from disagreeing with it, they will be able to install that ideology as the main one and not allow anyone to speak out against it. So this is an extremely important time for us to balance the research into AI safety as well as having this technology be open. We don't want to have a brainwashed superintelligence. With that said, my name is Wes Roth, and thank you for watching.